He built a luxury empire on quiet prejudice, but the night he turned away the wrong couple, everything began to crumble. This is the powerful, true-to-life tale of Charles Whitmore, a man who thought wealth gave him the right to decide who belonged. When David and Vanessa Reynolds walked into his exclusive restaurant to celebrate their anniversary, he saw only the color of their skin, not the legacy they were about to rewrite. What follows isn't just justice. It's a stunning reversal of power, respect, and legacy. If stories of redemption, truth, and poetic justice move you, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives like this. Tap the bell so you don't miss the next story that just might change how you see the world. This isn't just storytelling. It's a mirror to our society. Let's talk about it. At 58 years old, Charles Whitmore had everything he had ever wanted: wealth, success, and influence. As the owner of La Belle Vie, an upscale French restaurant in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, he had crafted a reputation that was nearly untouchable. His establishment was synonymous with luxury, the kind of place where the elite gathered, shielded from the distractions of the outside world. From the moment guests stepped through the intricately carved oak doors, they were enveloped in an atmosphere of refinement. The crystal chandeliers draped the dining room in a warm golden glow, casting soft light over pristine white tablecloths. Each table was meticulously arranged with fresh floral centerpieces imported weekly from Paris. The air carried the faint aroma of truffle butter, aged wine, and the subtle notes of classical music playing in the background. It was, as Charles often described it, a sanctuary for the sophisticated. But behind the carefully curated image of exclusivity, there was something else, a belief that Charles had never dared to say out loud, but had shaped every decision he made. He believed that not everyone belonged in his restaurant. Charles prided himself on being able to read people within seconds. The way they walked, how they dressed, the confidence, or lack thereof, in their posture. Over the years, he had perfected the art of discretion, ensuring that his restaurant remained a place for the right kind of patrons. Officially, there was no policy of exclusion. There were no outright refusals, no signs barring entry to anyone based on race, background, or status. But Charles didn't need such overt barriers. He had other ways. When reservations were made by names that didn't quite fit, they were often lost in the system. If someone from a less desirable background did manage to secure a table, they would be placed near the kitchen doors, far from the coveted spots beneath the chandeliers. Service would be subtly slower. The warm hospitality offered to regulars would be replaced with a cool, distant professionalism. Those who didn't feel welcome rarely returned, and that was precisely the point. Charles had built his restaurant from the ground up. Decades ago, he had started as a chef, working his way through the ranks in some of the country's finest dining establishments. He had learned everything there was to know about the restaurant business, not just the art of cuisine, but the power of exclusivity. And when he finally opened La Belle Vie, he understood that its success would not just be about food, but about image. It wasn't enough to serve world-class dishes. People needed to believe they were part of something elite, something that not everyone could access. So Charles ensured that La Belle Vie wasn't just a restaurant. It was a status symbol. He cultivated relationships with influential figures, judges, business moguls, renowned artists. He hosted exclusive invitation-only wine tastings, partnering with high-end vineyards in France and Italy. Articles in luxury lifestyle magazines hailed La Belle Vie as the pinnacle of fine dining, a place where only those with discerning taste and social prestige could truly appreciate its value. The city's wealthiest patrons dined there, confident in the knowledge that they were among their own kind. And Charles made sure it stayed that way. To most, Charles appeared polite, charming even. He never raised his voice, never showed outward hostility. His prejudices were carefully veiled behind the kind of smooth professionalism that made him seem untouchable. But for those who paid attention, his biases were clear. When a white couple arrived underdressed, he would offer them a seat with a gracious nod, perhaps even an apology for the inconvenience if the dining room was particularly full. When a well-dressed black couple arrived, however, he would scrutinize them just a fraction longer than necessary. If they had a reservation, he would feign surprise, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. Their table would be near the back, away from the center of attention. Their service, though not rude. And if they were bold enough to act as though they belonged, to engage with the staff in a family, Charles had always told himself that he wasn't racist. He simply valued tradition. He was merely maintaining the standard of his establishment. And yet, deep down, he knew. He knew a quietly tolerated prejudice. Those who worked at La Belle Vie were well aware of Charles Whitmore's silent biases. They had seen it play out time and time again. The way he scrutinized certain guests more than others, the way he subtly orchestrated seating arrangements, and the way some reservations conveniently disappeared from the system. Some of his employees disagreed with his unspoken rules, but they kept their opinions to themselves. They had families to feed, bills to pay, and careers to protect. Speaking out against a powerful restaurant owner like Charles wasn't just risky, it was a potential career-ending move. Others, however, shared Charles's mindset. They believed in maintaining the restaurant's exclusivity and saw nothing wrong with ensuring that only a certain type of clientele walked through the grand oak doors. These employees upheld his standards without question, convinced that catering to the wealthy elite justified any unspoken prejudice. No one challenged him. Charles never needed to give direct orders to enforce his biases. His employees understood them implicitly. A glance, a subtle nod, a pause too long in response to a certain type of guest. It was enough. And so, La Belle Vie continued operating under its carefully disguised system of exclusion, a machine so well-oiled that no one ever dared to stop it. Charles was in control. At least that's what he believed. For decades, Charles Whitmore had crafted a delicate illusion, a world where the right people dined in elegance, while the wrong ones were quietly discouraged from staying. He had spent years ensuring that La Belle Vie remained untouched by the outside world, a sanctuary for the privileged few. His system had worked flawlessly for years, but the world was changing. The city was evolving. New businesses were emerging, ones that valued inclusivity over exclusion, ones that welcomed talent and diversity instead of suppressing it. The dining scene was shifting, and yet Charles remained confident that his establishment would stand firm, unchanged, untouchable. He had spent decades perfecting his restaurant's reputation, cultivating relationships with the city's most powerful figures, and ensuring that his idea of refinement remained intact. But all it would take was one night, one couple, one moment, and everything Charles Whitmore had built would come crashing down. And the worst part, he would never see it coming. The evening was perfect for a celebration. The city lights shimmered against the night sky, and a cool autumn breeze drifted through the streets. For David and Vanessa Reynolds, this night had been long anticipated, a celebration of their 10th wedding anniversary. A decade of love, challenges, and victories deserved to be honored, and they had chosen La Belle Vie, one of the finest restaurants in the city, as the perfect place to mark the occasion. Vanessa had spent the afternoon getting ready, slipping into a scarlet evening gown that cascaded elegantly over her figure. Her dark curls framed her face perfectly, accentuating her radiant smile. David, ever the gentleman, wore a charcoal black tailored suit, a subtle silver pocket square peeking from his lapel. Together, they were the picture of success, confidence, and grace, two people who had worked tirelessly to achieve their dreams. But none of that mattered to Charles Whitmore. From the moment David and Vanessa stepped through the grand entrance of La Belle Vie, Charles's eyes narrowed. He had long prided himself on his ability to assess people instantly, to know, without question, who belonged in his establishment and who didn't. And despite their impeccable attire, despite their clear sophistication, Charles had already decided they did not belong. He forced a polished smile as he greeted them. "Good evening," he said smoothly, though his voice lacked its usual warmth. "Do you have a reservation with us tonight?" David smiled back, unaware, or perhaps choosing to ignore, the subtle edge in the host's tone. Yes, under Reynolds. Charles gave a slight nod, glancing toward his maitre d', Thomas, standing a few feet behind him. The gesture was nearly imperceptible, but Thomas had worked under Charles long enough to understand exactly what it meant. Check again. Find a reason to say no. The maitre d' skimmed the reservation list before looking back at Charles with a hesitant nod. The reservation was indeed there. There was no excuse to turn them away. Ah, yes, Charles finally said, though his lips tightened slightly. Right this way. He turned and led them through the restaurant, past tables adorned with crystal stemware and fine china, past well-dressed patrons engaged in quiet conversation over candlelit dinners. The prime tables, the ones near the grand floor-to-ceiling windows with a breathtaking view of the city skyline, were filled with his usual clientele: lawyers, business moguls, politicians. Instead of seating David and Vanessa among them, he directed them toward the back, a small, less desirable table tucked near the kitchen doors, where the occasional clang of pots and the murmur of staff orders disrupted the otherwise serene ambiance. David exchanged a glance with Vanessa, noting the placement immediately, but they said nothing. Charles watched them closely, waiting for a flicker of discomfort, a sign that they felt out of place, that they would decide on their own to leave. But they didn't. Instead, David pulled out the chair for Vanessa, a gentleman through and through, and took his own seat. Thank you, Vanessa said, her tone polite, but her eyes sharp. Charles gave a brief nod, but his mind was already racing. They're not uncomfortable enough. Yet. From his usual post near the entrance, Charles discreetly watched the couple. His fingers tapped against the mahogany podium as he observed how at ease they seemed, as if they had every right to be there. That bothered him. He had already decided they weren't supposed to fit in, and yet they did. Too well. So he adjusted his approach. He called Thomas over. Delay their service, Charles murmured, his voice low but firm. The maitre d' hesitated for a brief moment, but nodded. He had seen this tactic before. The minutes passed. Tables around David and Vanessa received their wine, appetizers, and entrees, plates of delicately plated dishes, filet mignon, butter-seared scallops, truffle-infused risottos. Meanwhile, the Reynolds table remained empty. Vanessa sipped her water and glanced at David. He gave her a reassuring smile, though he too had noticed. But they refused to react, refused to give Charles the satisfaction of seeing them unsettled. After 40 minutes, their waiter, a young man who looked noticeably uncomfortable, finally arrived. My apologies for the delay, he muttered, setting down their appetizers with hands that trembled slightly. The kitchen's a little backed up tonight. David tilted his head slightly, glancing at the nearly full dining room, where other tables had been served effortlessly, but he only smiled. No problem, he said, voice smooth as ever. Thank you. Vanessa nodded in agreement, unfolding her napkin with measured grace. Charles felt his jaw clench. Despite his calculated efforts, David and Vanessa remained unshaken. They conversed softly, shared smiles, and even laughed at a private joke, completely at ease, as though La Belle Vie was no different than any other fine dining restaurant they had visited. Charles couldn't stand it, so he approached their table himself. Mr. Reynolds, Mrs. Reynolds, he said smoothly, I trust everything is to your satisfaction? David looked up, his expression polite but knowing. Everything's fine, Mr. Whitmore, he replied. Charles narrowed his eyes just slightly. I must say, he continued, feigning curiosity, I was surprised to see your reservation. We don't often have, guests who are unfamiliar with our establishment. David didn't blink. We've heard wonderful things about La Belle Vie, he said, so we thought we'd celebrate our 10th anniversary here. For the briefest moment, Charles hesitated. 10 years, a decade of love, and he had just spent the evening trying to ruin it, but his pride wouldn't let him falter. I see, Charles said, his tone measured, though I must say, La Belle Vie maintains a certain standard, a level of exclusivity. I just want to be sure you're aware of the kind of clientele we cater to. The meaning behind his words was clear. You don't belong here. For the first time, Vanessa spoke. Her voice was soft but firm, carrying a quiet strength that couldn't be ignored. "We understand your standards, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her gaze unwavering, "and we appreciate them. It's why we chose to celebrate here." David leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table with deliberate ease. His expression remained calm, yet there was an undeniable sharpness in his eyes. "I assume you have a reason for telling us this?" The challenge was unmistakable. For the first time that evening, Charles felt his confidence slip. These two weren't rattled. They weren't intimidated, and he hated it. Finally, he did what he had wanted to do since the moment they walked in. "I'm afraid I must insist," he said, his voice losing its forced politeness. "This may not be the right place for you. Perhaps another establishment would be better suited to your needs." Silence. For a moment, time seemed to stretch between them. David and Vanessa exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. No anger, no outburst, just a quiet understanding. Then David slowly stood, straightening his jacket with deliberate composure. Vanessa followed, lifting her clutch from the table with effortless grace. David turned to Charles, looking him in the eye. His voice was calm, steady, a voice of certainty, not submission. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Whitmore." Then without another word, they turned and walked out. Charles watched them go, a flicker of satisfaction tightening his chest. But as the heavy doors swung shut behind them, he felt something else too. Something uneasy, something he couldn't quite name. And though he didn't realize it yet, this night would come back to haunt him. Because the people he had just dismissed, they weren't just any couple. And soon enough, he would find out exactly who they were. David Reynolds had spent his entire career learning two things: when to stand his ground and when to walk away. That night, as he and Vanessa stepped out of Whitmore's fine dining, he knew without a doubt that leaving had been the right choice. It wasn't that he and Vanessa were afraid to fight. They had fought plenty of battles in their lives, against doubt, discrimination, and closed doors that were never meant to be opened for people like them. They had learned to navigate those spaces, to rise above, to claim their place in rooms where they weren't always welcome. But that night, they had both sensed that this wasn't a battle worth fighting. Not yet. Whitmore had expected them to get angry, to lash out, to give him a reason to call security and have them thrown out like criminals. He had wanted them to feel small, to feel out of place. He had been waiting for them to crack, but instead they had left on their own terms, their dignity intact. Vanessa walked beside him, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. The crisp night air was cool against her skin, but her expression remained poised, unreadable. She carried herself with the same grace she always did, unshaken, unwavering. David knew that look. He had seen it in high-stakes business meetings, in courtrooms, in places where people had underestimated Vanessa simply because she was a black woman. They never saw it coming, the way she could cut through arrogance with a single measured word. She had held back tonight, and that, David knew, was far more dangerous than if she had fought back in the moment. They both knew there were better ways to win. Vanessa glanced at him, her lips curling into a knowing smile. "He wanted us to react," she said quietly. David exhaled, shaking his head. "Yeah, and we didn't give him what he wanted." "He's used to controlling people in his space," Vanessa continued. "Tonight, he lost control. That's what's really bothering him." David nodded. She was right. Whitmore prided himself on curating an environment, one that catered to the wealthy, the privileged, the elite. He decided who belonged and who didn't. And when David and Vanessa had walked through those doors, successful, confident, and unapologetically themselves, they had thrown off the balance of the world he had so carefully built. And he had hated it. Whitmore had wanted them to feel like they didn't belong. But David knew better. He had spent his entire life building his own table rather than waiting for a seat at someone else's. Vanessa stopped walking and turned to face him fully, the glow of the street lamp illuminating her features. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" David chuckled. "That depends. Are you thinking about making Charles Whitmore regret this moment for the rest of his life?" Vanessa's smile widened. "Absolutely." David let out a low laugh, shaking his head. "You know, most people would just leave and never come back." Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "We're not most people." And they weren't. Because Charles Whitmore had just made the worst mistake of his life. He had dismissed them as outsiders. He had treated them as though they didn't belong. But what he didn't know, what he hadn't even bothered to learn, was that David and Vanessa Reynolds weren't just any couple enjoying an anniversary dinner. They were power players in the hospitality industry. They had built their careers buying, transforming, and elevating restaurants just like his. And now Whitmore's fine dining had just become their next target. By the time they got home that night, any lingering anger had transformed into something far more dangerous: focus. Vanessa poured herself a glass of wine and settled into the sleek leather chair in David's home office. David had already pulled out his laptop, fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard as he started digging. They both knew that revenge wasn't about emotion, it was about execution. They didn't need to raise their voices. They didn't need to argue. They just needed to hit Whitmore where it hurt the most: his business. "Let's start with the basics," Vanessa murmured, scanning her own screen. "How financially stable is he?" David clicked through a few reports before smirking. "Not as stable as he pretends to be." Whitmore's fine dining looked successful on the surface. It was exclusive, high-end, and always fully booked. But behind the scenes, it was bleeding money. "He expanded too fast," Vanessa observed, her gaze sharp. "Took out a massive loan 2 years ago. Probably thought he could turn it into a franchise." David shook his head. "Classic mistake. Too much ambition, not enough strategy." Vanessa smirked. "And here I thought he was a genius." David leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "So, what's our angle? Buy him out?" Vanessa's smile was slow and deliberate. "Oh, we're not just going to buy him out." She took a slow sip of wine before setting the glass down. "We're going to make him come to us." David grinned. David leaned back, a slow grin forming as the plan crystallized in his mind. "Now that," he murmured, "is a plan." Vanessa met his gaze, her expression calm but knowing. It was time to act. Step 1. Controlling the lease. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the groundwork was already being laid. David's first priority was securing control of Whitmore's fine dining's lease, the very foundation of the restaurant's operations. Without it, Whitmore had no restaurant, no empire, no legacy. David knew exactly who to call. Within hours, he had arranged a private meeting with Jacob Ellison, the influential real estate mogul who owned the building where La Belle Vie, formerly Whitmore's fine dining, was located. Jacob wasn't a sentimental man. He had no personal ties to Charles Whitmore, no loyalty to uphold. He didn't care about history or legacy. He cared about numbers. And David had very good numbers. The meeting took place in Jacob's high-rise office, where the scent of fresh espresso lingered in the air. The mogul leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping against his desk as David laid out his proposition. "I want to take over Whitmore's lease," David said smoothly. Jacob raised an eyebrow. "Whitmore still has time to renew." "I know," David replied, sliding a folder across the desk. "But I also know he's in a weak financial position. If you sell to me, you'll have a long-term tenant who can guarantee profitability." Jacob glanced at the documents, financial projections, industry reports, market trends, all pointing to one undeniable fact. David Reynolds was a better investment than Charles Whitmore. Within a few days, the deal was already in motion. By the time Whitmore realized what was happening, it would be too late. The very building his restaurant operated from would no longer be his to control. And that was just the beginning. Step 2. Applying pressure on investors. While David handled the real estate aspect, Vanessa used her legal expertise to dig deeper into Whitmore's financial situation. She combed through records, analyzed his debts, and identified key players who held a financial stake in his restaurant chain. Whitmore wasn't just a restaurant owner. He was accountable to investors. And investors didn't care about personal pride. They cared about profit. Sitting in her office, Vanessa made call after call, arranging discreet meetings with Whitmore's board members and financial backers. One by one, she laid out the reality of the situation. Whitmore's business model was outdated. While his restaurant had once thrived on exclusivity, the industry was changing. Fine dining was evolving, and Whitmore had failed to adapt. The public image of Whitmore's fine dining was tarnished. Whispers of discrimination had begun circulating, and in an era where reputation meant everything, his brand was at risk. They had an alternative, one that guaranteed success. Vanessa wasn't just asking them to abandon Whitmore. She was giving them a better option. "If you back us," she said smoothly in one meeting, "we'll take Whitmore's fine dining to the next level. We'll modernize it, expand its clientele, and ensure sustainable profitability." Investors weren't fools. They saw the writing on the wall. And when it came down to Whitmore's stubborn pride versus a new leadership team promising growth, the choice was easy. Before long, Whitmore's investors began pulling their support. Phone calls to him went unanswered. Promised funding suddenly dried up. The walls were closing in. Step 3. The offer he couldn't refuse. With the lease slipping out of his grasp and his investors abandoning ship, Charles Whitmore was quickly running out of options. David and Vanessa knew the time was right. They prepared the final move, the offer that would force Whitmore's hand. A formal letter was sent through one of the most prestigious law firms in the country. The wording was polite, professional, and direct. An offer had been made to purchase Whitmore's fine dining in its entirety. It wasn't a lowball offer. It was generous, intentionally so. Because David and Vanessa weren't just taking his restaurant, they were making sure he had no way to fight back. The contract left no room for negotiation. The sale would be immediate. Whitmore would never be allowed to open another competing restaurant. He would have to walk away quietly. No statements, no explanations, no damage control. If Whitmore refused, David and Vanessa had the leverage to dismantle him completely. The restaurant industry was small, and a reputation for discrimination could destroy someone overnight. If Whitmore tried to hold out, they would expose his actions, his biases, his exclusionary tactics, the carefully veiled racism he had upheld for years. And once that information became public, his entire career would be over. Whitmore didn't know it yet, but he was backed into a corner, and when the time came, he would have no choice but to sell. David leaned back in his chair, staring at the finalized contract. "We're ready," he said. Vanessa nodded, closing her laptop. "Now," she said, a slow smile forming. "We wait." Because soon enough, Charles Whitmore would have to face the inevitable. And by the time he realized what had happened, it would already be too late. Charles Whitmore sat in his office, the dim glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the mahogany surface. It had been a long day, but there was never truly a short day when you owned a restaurant empire. Owning and managing an upscale chain of fine dining establishments meant constant attention to detail, endless decision-making, and ensuring the right clientele walked through the doors. He took a slow sip of his bourbon, savoring the warmth as he leaned back in his chair. Whitmore's fine dining was more than just a business to him. It was his legacy. He had built it from the ground up, cultivating an air of exclusivity that attracted only the best patrons. His eyes drifted to the stack of mail on his desk, most of it routine correspondence from vendors, reservation lists, and financial reports. But one envelope stood out. It was crisp, heavy, and bore the logo of Mitchell and Hartman, LLP, one of the most prestigious law firms in the country. Curiosity piqued, Charles picked up the envelope, sliding a silver letter opener through the seal. He unfolded the letter carefully, scanning the neatly typed words. "Dear Mr. Whitmore, our client has expressed significant interest in acquiring Whitmore's fine dining. Given the standing of your restaurant chain, they are prepared to make an offer that we believe will be of great interest to you. Due to the nature of the transaction, they request a private meeting to discuss the terms in detail. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to schedule a discussion." The letter was direct, formal, and enticing. Someone wanted to buy his empire. Charles's lips curled into a slow smirk. He had no intention of selling. Not really. But everything had a price, and if the offer was lucrative enough, he would entertain the conversation. After all, if the buyer was willing to put down a significant sum, perhaps he could leverage the offer to secure a better financial position, maybe even expand. He tapped his fingers against the desk, deep in thought. Yes, he would meet them. See who was willing to pay for the privilege of taking his name. Little did he know, this was a meeting that would change everything. 2 days later, Charles arrived at Mitchell and Hartman's towering glass office building in the heart of the city. Everything about the firm exuded wealth and power, the kind of place where multi-million-dollar deals were sealed over handshakes and carefully worded contracts. Dressed in his finest charcoal suit, Charles strode through the marble lobby with confidence. He wasn't nervous. He was in his element. He had negotiated million-dollar deals before. This would be no different. He was ushered into a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. A polished mahogany table stretched across the center, flanked by plush leather chairs. A few neatly arranged folders sat on the table, and then the doors opened. Charles turned, expecting to see corporate executives or finance moguls. But when he saw who actually walked in, his breath caught in his throat. David and Vanessa Reynolds. Charles's body tensed. This had to be some kind of joke. The same couple he had dismissed from his restaurant. The same people he had subtly insulted, belittled, and made to feel unwelcome. They were the buyers? Number impossible, but the moment David and Vanessa strode confidently into the room, Charles knew this was real. David was dressed impeccably in a tailored navy blue suit, his expression calm but unyielding. Vanessa, equally poised, wore a sleek black dress, her posture effortlessly elegant. They looked every bit like the power players they were. Charles's throat went dry. Vanessa set a sleek leather briefcase on the table, clicking it open with quiet precision. "Mr. Whitmore," she said smoothly, her voice carrying an air of authority that sent an uncomfortable shiver down Charles's spine. David took a seat across from Charles, unrushed, relaxed, like a man completely in control. "Good to see you again," David said, his tone polite but firm. Charles struggled to regain his composure. He cleared his throat. "I wasn't expecting you." David's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "No, I don't imagine you were." Silence settled between them, thick and heavy. Finally, Charles forced a chuckle, leaning back in his chair in an attempt to appear unbothered. "So, you're the ones behind this offer?" Vanessa slid a contract across the table toward him. "We are." Charles picked up the folder, flipping it open. His eyes scanned the staggering numbers printed on the page. The offer wasn't just generous. It was astronomical. It was far beyond what he had anticipated. "Why?" he asked, his voice quieter now. David folded his hands on the table. "Because we believe your restaurant chain has value. Your brand has potential," Vanessa added smoothly, "under the right leadership." Charles felt heat rise to his face. Under the right leadership? He had built Whitmore's fine dining from nothing. He had shaped it into a symbol of prestige. And now these two were sitting here, offering him a fortune, but implying that they could do better. His fingers tightened around the folder. "And what makes you think I would ever sell to you?" Charles asked, voice sharp. David's expression remained unreadable. "You don't have much of a choice," Vanessa replied calmly. Charles stiffened. "Excuse me?" David exhaled, tilting his head slightly. "We've already secured the lease for your flagship restaurant?" Charles's stomach dropped. "We also had a conversation with your investors," Vanessa continued. "They're eager to cash out." Charles's jaw clenched. He had never felt this out of control. His business, his empire, was slipping through his fingers. He swallowed hard, trying to salvage his pride. "This is ridiculous. You expect me to just walk away?" David leaned forward slightly. "I expect you to think carefully, Mr. Whitmore. This isn't just one restaurant we're talking about." Vanessa nodded toward the contract. "We're offering to buy everything, the entire Whitmore's fine dining chain." Charles's breath hitched. This wasn't just an offer. This was a complete takeover, and he never saw it coming. Charles sat in stunned silence, staring down at the contract that could make him wealthier than he had ever imagined, but at the cost of everything he had built. David and Vanessa didn't press him. They simply waited, and that was the worst part. They had already won. They didn't need to convince him. They had outmaneuvered him completely. His pride screamed at him to refuse, to hold on, to fight. But deep down he knew there was no fight left to win. He had judged them, dismissed them, treated them like they didn't belong. And now? Now they owned the table. Charles Whitmore had spent decades building his restaurant empire, crafting its reputation, and ensuring that only a certain kind of clientele walked through its doors. He had prided himself on exclusivity, on curating an environment that catered to the city's elite, wealthy patrons who appreciated fine dining in a refined, carefully controlled atmosphere. He had also spent decades keeping people like David and Vanessa Reynolds out, and now they were the ones holding the keys to his future. As he sat in the conference room of Mitchell and Hartman LLP, Charles struggled to process the unthinkable. The same couple he had humiliated and cast out of his restaurant were now offering to buy his entire empire. Not just one location, his entire chain. And the worst part? They were offering him more than he had ever dreamed of. The figure on the contract was staggering. The amount was well above market value, a deal any businessman in his right mind would leap at. But as he scanned the pages, his stomach tightened. Because the offer came with conditions. Strict, merciless conditions. David sat across from him, watching him carefully, his hands clasped together on the polished mahogany table. Vanessa, poised and unreadable, sat beside her husband, waiting in silence. Charles swallowed, gripping the contract as he read the terms again. 1. The sale must be immediate. No drawn-out negotiations, no time to regroup, strategize, or look for another buyer. If he accepted, it would all be over within the week. 2. He must never open another competing restaurant. His career in the fine dining industry, his identity, would be permanently severed. He could never build another Whitmore's, never create a new version of what he had lost. 3. He must leave quietly. No statements to the press, no interviews, no spinning the narrative to make himself look like a victim. He would disappear from the industry without so much as a farewell to his loyal patrons. Charles felt his hands tighten into fists. This wasn't a business deal. This was an execution. His chest burned as he looked up, locking eyes with David. "This is absurd," Charles said finally, forcing his voice to remain steady. "You want me to walk away from the business I built? Forever?" David didn't flinch. "Yes." Charles's jaw tightened. "That's not how this works. I'm a businessman. I should be able to negotiate terms." "There is no negotiation," Vanessa interrupted coolly. Her voice was calm, professional, unyielding. Charles turned his glare toward her. "You expect me to just sign away my legacy?" David leaned forward slightly, his expression hardening. "You mean the same legacy that refused to serve us with dignity?" His tone was still measured, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath it. "The same legacy that quietly ensured certain people never felt welcome? The same legacy that was built on exclusion, not excellence?" Charles's mouth went dry. He had spent years making decisions. Who belonged in his restaurants, who didn't? Who would receive impeccable service? Who would be subtly encouraged never to return? And now the people he had deemed unworthy were offering him a check to disappear. He forced out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. "This is about revenge, isn't it?" David didn't blink. "This is about business." Vanessa crossed her arms. "You understand business, don't you, Mr. Whitmore?" He bristled at the way she said his name. Cool, clipped, unimpressed. They weren't just here to buy him out. They were here to erase him. Charles sat back, exhaling slowly, trying to find a way out. "You said there's no negotiation," he murmured, carefully keeping his voice controlled. "But let's say I refuse." Vanessa glanced at David. David's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. But it wasn't amusement. It was the expression of a man who already knew how this would end. "If you refuse," David said slowly, "we walk away from the table." Charles scoffed. "Good. Then this ridiculous conversation is over." David continued as if he hadn't spoken. "And then we tell the world exactly who you are." Silence. Charles felt his blood run cold. "We tell your investors," Vanessa added. "We tell your board. We tell the media. The elite circles you pride yourself on, the ones who uphold your image of class and exclusivity, they'll turn their backs on you the moment we expose what happened that night." Charles swallowed, his throat tight. "You don't have proof." David tilted his head. "You sure about that?" For the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into Charles's mind. Had someone recorded the encounter? Had a diner overheard his comments? He had been careful. He always was. But was he careful enough? Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp. You built your business on an image, she said, and we both know what happens when an image gets shattered. Charles's stomach churned. The people who dined at his restaurants, the politicians, the executives, the socialites, they didn't care about what he truly believed. They cared about appearances. And if it came out that the esteemed Charles Whitmore had discriminated against a successful black couple in his own establishment, they wouldn't stand by him. They'd protect themselves. No one would want their name associated with a scandal like that. His reservations would plummet. His investors would start pulling out. And within months, weeks even, his empire would crumble. He clenched his jaw, gripping the armrest of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. Vanessa sat back, folding her hands in her lap. So, Mr. Whitmore, she said evenly, what's it going to be? Charles's pulse pounded in his ears. For the first time in his life, he was completely, utterly trapped. If he refused, he would be ruined. If he accepted, he would lose everything. But at least he'd be wealthy. It was a humiliating choice. A choice that told him, without question, that his arrogance had cost him everything. He glanced down at the contract again. The number at the bottom of the page was staggering. It was enough to retire, to disappear, to escape. But it wasn't his business. It wasn't his success. His legacy would belong to them. David and Vanessa Reynolds, the people he had once deemed unworthy, would take everything he had spent decades building and make it their own. And the world would see them as the saviors of Whitmore's fine dining. Charles could already picture it. A press release announcing the new ownership, news outlets celebrating the modernization of the brand, a headline that would cut deeper than anything else. Whitmore's fine dining thrives under new, inclusive leadership. He felt sick, but there was no escape. With a heavy, trembling breath, he picked up the pen. His hand hovered over the signature line. He could hear David and Vanessa waiting, calm, patient. They knew he had no other option. They had planned this from the start. He had lost the moment they walked into this room. Finally, he signed. And just like that, Charles Whitmore ceased to exist. Not in name, not in body, but in legacy. The world would move on. His name would fade. And David and Vanessa, they would be remembered. Because in the end, the only thing Charles Whitmore truly owned was regret. Charles Whitmore had once been a name that carried weight in high society. He was the man behind Whitmore's fine dining, an empire built on exclusivity, sophistication, and an unspoken set of rules about who truly belonged. For years, he had carefully crafted his image, an untouchable figure in the city's elite dining scene, a man whose establishments catered only to those with the right pedigree. But now everything was unraveling. The ink on the contract had barely dried when news of the sale exploded across media outlets. At first, the public saw it as just another high-profile business transaction, a well-known restaurant chain being sold to prominent new owners. But then, the real story emerged, and it was far more damning than Charles ever could have imagined. David and Vanessa Reynolds didn't need to expose him directly. They didn't have to hold a press conference or publish a tell-all article. The story told itself. The whispers started in the right places. A journalist at a business magazine heard murmurs about the strange circumstances of the sale. An anonymous source, perhaps a former employee, perhaps a former client, hinted at the reason behind it. And soon a headline that no amount of damage control could contain appeared on social media, then on news sites, then on TV screens across the country. Whitmore's fine dining sold after racial discrimination scandal. Charles felt his stomach turn the first time he saw it. A wave of panic swept through him as he clicked the link, heart pounding in his chest. The article was brutal. It detailed everything. Not just the night David and Vanessa had been turned away, but years of subtle racism that had shaped Whitmore's policies. Former employees came forward. They shared stories about how black patrons were always seated near the kitchen or by the bathrooms. How reservations under certain last names were often mysteriously lost. How Charles himself had given explicit instructions to his managers about who was truly welcome and who was merely tolerated. Some employees had left the company because of it. Others had stayed quiet, afraid of the power Charles held. But now that power was gone, and suddenly everyone was willing to talk. A reputation in freefall. The fallout was immediate. Charles had spent decades cultivating relationships with wealthy clients, powerful investors, and respected figures in the business world. But the moment the scandal broke, those relationships began to crumble. Former clients turned their backs. The socialites and executives who had once flocked to his restaurants now wanted nothing to do with him. Some released statements distancing themselves from Whitmore's fine dining. Others simply stopped returning his calls. The wealthy patrons who had once prided themselves on dining at Whitmore's suddenly found themselves facing scrutiny. Had they known? Had they supported his discrimination? In a world where image was everything, people couldn't afford to be associated with a racist businessman who had been exposed. And so, they cut ties. Investors pull out. The investors who had once poured millions into his brand began quietly backing away. Some sold their shares overnight, afraid of being linked to the controversy. Others terminated future business deals with him, citing the need to protect their reputations. It didn't matter that Charles had already sold the company. To them, his name was now a liability. And in high-stakes business, liabilities were eliminated. No more opportunities. The worst part? Charles had always believed that if he ever stepped away from the restaurant industry, he could rebuild elsewhere. Start another venture, invest in new opportunities, reinvent himself. But the scandal had closed those doors forever. No one wanted to work with him. Not the restaurant world, not the hospitality industry, not anyone. His name had become toxic, and in the business world, a toxic name was the kiss of death. At first, Charles told himself it would blow over, that people would move on, that something else would make headlines, and his disgrace would be forgotten. But weeks passed, then months, and the damage was permanent. He stopped receiving invitations to the elite charity galas he had once attended. His phone, which had once been flooded with business calls, stopped ringing. Friends he had known for decades suddenly had other commitments. He tried reaching out to old contacts, hoping for a second chance, but no one was willing to risk their own reputations to help him. For the first time in his life, Charles Whitmore was truly alone. He had always surrounded himself with powerful people, with those who admired his success. But when the success was gone, so were they. The pariah of his own empire. One evening, Charles found himself standing outside Whitmore's fine dining. Well, it wasn't his anymore. The restaurant was still there, but the name had changed. The sign that had once read Whitmore's Fine Dining had been replaced with a sleek new design. Reynolds Fine Dining. His stomach twisted at the sight of it. Through the glass windows, he could see a full house. The tables were packed, the chandeliers glowing, the waitstaff moving with the same efficiency he had once prided himself on. But the crowd was different now, more diverse, more lively, more welcoming. It was thriving in a way that his restaurants never had. His grip tightened on his coat. He wanted to walk inside. He wanted to demand to know what they had changed, what they had done differently, how they had taken his empire and somehow made it better. But he knew the truth. It was never his empire to begin with. It had been an illusion, built on exclusion and elitism, a foundation so weak that the moment it was exposed, it had collapsed. And now David and Vanessa Reynolds owned what he had spent a lifetime believing was his. The thought was unbearable. His feet refused to move. For the first time in his life, he truly understood what it felt like to not belong. With a final glance at the restaurant that no longer had space for him, Charles turned and walked away. The world had moved on, and he had no place in it anymore. Months passed, then a year, then two. No one spoke of Charles Whitmore anymore. He had vanished from the industry. The new owners of his former empire, David and Vanessa Reynolds, were praised for modernizing and revitalizing the brand. The restaurants thrived. Their success was featured in business magazines, in interviews and stories about what true leadership looked like. And Charles? His name was barely a footnote, a cautionary tale whispered in business circles, a reminder that in the modern world, exclusion wasn't power, it was a weakness, and that those who refused to change would be left behind. Charles Whitmore had once ruled over an empire. Now, he ruled over nothing, and no one mourned his downfall. A new era for La Belle Vie, David and Vanessa Reynolds' vision. The transition was swift, efficient, and transformational. The moment David and Vanessa Reynolds took over the restaurant empire, once known as Whitmore's Fine Dining, they set their sights on a radical reinvention. Charles Whitmore had built a business based on exclusion, a world of velvet ropes, whispered judgments, and an unspoken rulebook about who truly belonged. But under new ownership, that world ceased to exist, and in its place, a new era was born. Rebranding the legacy, the birth of La Belle Vie. The first and most critical decision was the name. Whitmore's Fine Dining was steeped in controversy and elitism, its reputation now tainted by the scandal surrounding Charles. David and Vanessa knew that no amount of modernizing could erase what the Whitmore name had come to represent. So they erased it themselves. The new name, La Belle Vie, translated to The Beautiful Life, a title that captured everything they envisioned for the restaurant's future. It was elegant, timeless, and spoke to the universal joy of fine dining. It wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was an experience, an invitation to anyone and everyone who valued exceptional food, impeccable service, and an atmosphere that made them feel truly welcome. And for the first time in decades, the restaurant truly lived up to its promise, creating an atmosphere of inclusion and excellence. The changes were subtle yet revolutionary. The grand chandeliers remained, casting their warm glow over the tables. The luxurious decor stayed, refined and refreshed to create an ambiance of effortless elegance. But the feeling in the air? That changed entirely. Gone were the cold, judging stares. Gone was the sense that one had to belong in order to simply dine. Instead, the energy of the restaurant shifted, a delicate balance between refinement and warmth. The first sign of this shift? The clientele. Under Charles Whitmore, the restaurant had catered almost exclusively to the city's wealthiest, most elite circles. But David and Vanessa redefined what elite meant. Their vision wasn't about excluding people based on race, background, or connections. It was about celebrating excellence. And excellence could be found in anyone who appreciated fine cuisine and a world-class dining experience. Now at La Belle Vie, a reservation list might include a renowned author finishing the final pages of her latest bestseller over a glass of wine, a young tech entrepreneur dressed in a sharp suit discussing his next big startup idea, a celebrated musician enjoying a quiet night out with family before a sold-out concert, a Black judge sharing a meal with her colleagues after presiding over a landmark case, a high school teacher celebrating a milestone anniversary with her husband in the same place they had once felt unwelcome. Wealth and status weren't prerequisites for being treated with dignity. At La Belle Vie, respect was the foundation of the experience, expanding the culinary vision. Charles Whitmore had been obsessive about maintaining a rigid, French-inspired menu, one that catered to a very specific palate. The dishes were undoubtedly masterpieces, but they lacked soul. They were created for show, not for the joy of eating. David and Vanessa changed that. They hired one of the country's most celebrated chefs, a rising star in the culinary world, who embraced global influences while preserving the restaurant's signature elegance. The menu expanded. Traditional French cuisine remained, but was enhanced with modern techniques and flavors. New signature dishes emerged, a Cajun spice seafood dish, inspired by Vanessa's southern roots, a rich and aromatic Moroccan lamb, a nod to David's travels through North Africa, a delicate fusion of Japanese and French flavors, paying tribute to a world that no longer saw cuisine through the lens of borders. And while fine dining remained at its core, a new philosophy took shape. Food is not just about sophistication, it's about connection. Each dish told a story. Each plate was an invitation to explore, to celebrate, to share. The response was overwhelming. La Belle Vie quickly gained recognition as a destination restaurant, one that didn't just offer a meal, it offered an experience worth remembering. Reservations soared, critics raved, and most importantly, guests returned again and again. Building a stronger team and honoring diversity. One of the most significant transformations at La Belle Vie was its staff. Under Charles Whitmore, hiring had always been discreetly biased. The front-of-house staff, the hosts, the servers, the managers, had always fit a particular mold. It wasn't blatant discrimination, it was quietly calculated exclusion. David and Vanessa dismantled that culture immediately. They sought out the best talent, not just those who fit a certain look, but those who brought passion, skill, and a commitment to excellence. The result? A diverse, dynamic team that transformed the entire guest experience. There were now multilingual hosts, ensuring that international guests felt just as welcome as locals. There were rising Black and Latino chefs in the kitchen, bringing their unique expertise to the dishes. There were young women stepping into leadership roles, breaking the unspoken rule that high-end dining was a man's world. The entire culture of the restaurant changed. And the team? They thrived. They took pride in their work. They felt valued, empowered, and motivated to create something greater than themselves. And it showed in every interaction. Service wasn't just polished, it was personal. Each guest felt like they mattered, because for the first time, they truly did. As the months passed, La Belle Vie became more than just a successful restaurant. It became a symbol of change, of redemption, of what fine dining could be when it embraced excellence without exclusion. David and Vanessa Reynolds didn't just save a failing restaurant empire, they rebuilt it. They transformed it into something far greater than Charles Whitmore ever could have imagined. And as they stood in their restaurant one evening, watching guests laugh, toast, and celebrate, Vanessa turned to David and smiled. "You think Charles ever imagined this?" she asked. David smirked. "Not in his wildest nightmares." Vanessa chuckled. "I think I like it better this way." David looked around, at the thriving business they had built, at the people who now filled the space with joy instead of judgment. "So do I," he said, and with that, they raised their glasses. To a new era, to La Belle Vie, to the beautiful life they had created, on their terms. The ultimate irony, Charles Whitmore's final lesson. A man without a legacy. Charles Whitmore sat alone in his modest apartment, staring at the cold, unremarkable walls that surrounded him. The grandeur he once took for granted, his lavish home, his designer suits, the exclusive invitations to high society events, was all gone. He had been a man of power, of influence. People used to respect him, or at least they pretended to. Now he was just another forgotten relic of a past that no longer welcomed him. The sale of his restaurant empire had left him with enough money to live comfortably, but money was never the issue. Power was, and that was what he had lost. For decades, Whitmore's fine dining had been the crown jewel of his career, the very thing that set him apart from others. He had cultivated an exclusive, elite clientele, ensuring that only a certain kind of guest frequented his establishment. He had built a sanctuary for the wealthy and well-connected, a place where he decided who belonged and who didn't. And now the restaurant had thrived without him. Worse, it had become something greater than he ever imagined, in the hands of the very people he had tried to exclude. That thought gnawed at him, keeping him up at night. David and Vanessa Reynolds, the very couple he had humiliated, the people he had dismissed, the people he had thrown out of his restaurant like they were beneath him. Now they owned everything he had built, and they had done what he never could. La Belle Vie was booming. The restaurant's transformation was not just successful, it was a revolution. It had become the place to dine, more prestigious than it had ever been under his rule. The very people he had once looked down upon, the ones he had considered unworthy of stepping foot in his establishment, were now the reason it was thriving. Every newspaper, every magazine, every food critic raved about the new La Belle Vie. It was no longer a playground for the elite few. It had become a symbol of fine dining done right. It maintained its luxury, but now it welcomed all who appreciated excellence. Charles could barely stand to read the headlines. A restaurant reborn, La Belle Vie's stunning reinvention under new ownership. How David and Vanessa Reynolds transformed an exclusive club into a dining experience for all poetic justice. The former Whitmore empire now flourishes without its prejudiced founder. That last headline stung the most. Charles had always prided himself on being a self-made man, someone who built his empire through hard work and dedication. But now, the world saw him for what he really was, a bitter, prejudiced man who had been undone by his own arrogance. And he knew they were right. One evening, Charles sat at his small dining table, eating a microwave meal in silence. The contrast between this and the multi-course feast he once enjoyed at his own restaurant was humiliating. As he took another bite of his bland meal, he thought about La Belle Vie. He had spent months avoiding it, refusing to even drive past the building, but the curiosity had become unbearable. He needed to see it. He needed to know what had become of his legacy. For a moment, the idea seemed ridiculous. Would they even let him in? Then again, why wouldn't they? David and Vanessa weren't the type to hold petty grudges. If they ran the restaurant the way the press claimed, they would welcome any guest who wanted to dine. Wouldn't they? It was a long shot, but he had to try. That night, Charles picked up the phone and dialed the number for La Belle Vie. A polite, professional voice answered after 2 rings. "Good evening. Thank you for calling La Belle Vie. How may I assist you?" Charles cleared his throat. He hadn't spoken to anyone from the restaurant in months, and now even placing a reservation felt strange. "Yes, I'd like to make a reservation for one. This weekend." There was a brief pause, followed by the familiar sound of a keyboard clicking. "Certainly, sir. May I have your name?" Charles hesitated for only a second before saying it. "Charles Whitmore." Another pause. Slightly longer this time. He swallowed hard. Did they recognize his name? After a moment, the hostess responded with the same professional tone. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore, but we don't have any availability this weekend." He frowned. "No availability at all?" "No, sir," she said politely. "We're fully booked." It didn't make sense. There had been times when Whitmore's fine dining was fully booked, but he always had a table. "Are you sure? I used to—" He stopped himself. The words felt pathetic even before he said them. "I understand, sir," the hostess said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "Perhaps you could try another date." Charles sat in silence. He knew what this was. She wasn't rude. She wasn't dismissive. She didn't say his name with contempt or mockery. But she didn't care who he was. That was worse. Once this was his restaurant. He had controlled who was allowed in and who wasn't. Now he was just another name on a list. And this time, the list didn't have space for him. After a moment, he forced himself to respond. "Right, I see. Thank you." He hung up. And then, for the first time in years, Charles Whitmore felt something close to despair. Charles had spent his entire life believing that power and exclusivity define success. He had convinced himself that keeping certain people out of his restaurant preserved its prestige, that his way was the right way. But the truth had been there all along. David and Vanessa hadn't just taken his business. They had exposed his greatest lie. They had proven that success didn't come from exclusion. It came from excellence. And in the end, the world didn't mourn the loss of Charles Whitmore's version of fine dining. It celebrated La Belle Vie, not because it had thrown out his legacy, but because it had transcended it. Charles sat alone in his apartment that night, staring at the dim glow of the streetlights outside his window. The ultimate irony had finally set in. The restaurant he once ruled with an iron grip now thrived without him. The world he once controlled had moved on, and he no longer belonged. It was too late to change the past, too late to undo the damage. Too late to be anything other than a bitter, forgotten man. And as Charles sat there, isolated and insignificant, he finally understood. His racism hadn't just cost him his business. It had cost him everything. For decades, Charles Whitmore had prided himself on being a man of distinction, a self-made success in the world of fine dining. He had built Whitmore's Fine Dining, now rebranded as La Belle Vie, from the ground up, molding it into what he believed to be the pinnacle of exclusivity and class. He dictated who belonged and who didn't, ensuring that his restaurant remained a sanctuary for the wealthy, the powerful, and, more importantly, the right kind of people. He thought of himself as a gatekeeper of refinement, as someone who upheld the highest standards. But in truth, he had been something else entirely, a bigot, and his bigotry had cost him everything. When David and Vanessa Reynolds first walked into his restaurant on their 10th wedding anniversary, Charles had seen nothing but their skin color. It hadn't mattered to him that David was a successful entrepreneur or that Vanessa was a highly accomplished attorney. It hadn't mattered that they had earned their place at the table. To Charles, they didn't fit. And so, in a moment of prejudice disguised as policy, he had dismissed them, subtly humiliating them before finally making it clear. They didn't belong, but they had belonged far more than he ever realized. David and Vanessa weren't just successful in their respective fields. They were leaders in the hospitality industry. They understood restaurants, service, and, most importantly, what makes a business truly thrive. And while Charles had tried to push them out, they had turned the moment into an opportunity. He had sought to make them feel small. Instead, he had made himself irrelevant. Poetic justice, more than just a business deal. David and Vanessa's revenge had been calculated, deliberate, and patient. They didn't lash out. They didn't seek to humiliate Charles publicly. They simply did something far worse. They took everything that mattered to him. They had outmaneuvered him in the business world, making an offer he couldn't refuse. And when he had finally realized who was behind the deal, it had been too late. They hadn't just bought his restaurant. They had bought his entire restaurant chain. They had taken his empire and reshaped it into something better. What had once been a place of quiet discrimination had now become a beacon of fine dining done right. Under their ownership, La Belle Vie flourished, not because they had lowered the standards of luxury, but because they had redefined what true luxury meant. Excellence without exclusion, elegance without arrogance. They hadn't just proven him wrong, they had made his version of success obsolete, the real cost of prejudice. For Charles, the sale had been the beginning of the end. At first, he had tried to convince himself that he had won. After all, the money was more than generous. He was set for life. But wealth wasn't what had defined him. Power was, and that was gone. His former investors turned their backs on him. His former colleagues distanced themselves. Even those who had once shared his outdated beliefs refused to be associated with him. The whispers started slowly, then grew into something louder. Did you hear what happened to Whitmore? He sold everything to the same couple he threw out of his restaurant. He lost his legacy over a racist decision. Charles found himself ostracized from the very elite circles he once dominated. No more invitations to high-profile events. No more calls from business partners. No more admiration from those who once respected him. Even the people who had once shared his prejudices abandoned him. No one wanted to be associated with a public failure. He wasn't just a former restaurant mogul. He was a cautionary tale. The moment of truth, after months of avoiding the place that had once been his entire world, Charles had made a decision. He would return, not as an owner, not as a decision maker, but simply as a guest. Surely they wouldn't deny him that. He called the restaurant, giving his name with the same confidence he once wielded as a weapon. But the response was simple. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore. We're fully booked." The words cut deeper than he expected. The voice on the other end wasn't rude. It wasn't mocking. It was simply professional. And that was what hurt the most. They didn't hate him. They didn't even care. His name, once the most powerful force in that restaurant, meant nothing. He was just another guest asking for a table. Just another man without power. For years, Charles had treated La Belle Vie as his private kingdom. Now he couldn't even step through the doors. As he sat in his apartment that night, staring at his phone in his hand, he finally understood. It wasn't just the money. It wasn't just the business. It wasn't even about losing the restaurant itself. It was about losing control. For the first time in his life, Charles wasn't the one deciding who belonged. Someone else had made that decision, and he wasn't on the list. The true meaning of success. David and Vanessa's revenge had been about more than money. It had been about justice. They hadn't ruined Charles. He had ruined himself. His prejudice had been his downfall. His arrogance had blinded him. And now his own rules had turned against him. The true lesson wasn't just that bigotry has consequences. It was that true success isn't about exclusivity. It's about respect, inclusion, and vision. Charles had spent his whole life keeping people out. David and Vanessa had built their success by welcoming people in. And in the end, that had made all the difference. Whitmore's fine dining was gone, but La Belle Vie was thriving. And Charles Whitmore? He had been erased from the story altogether. The man who once decided who belonged now belonged nowhere. Throughout history, countless individuals have believed that power, success, and influence are best preserved by exclusivity, by keeping certain people in and pushing others out. The story of Charles Whitmore, David and Vanessa Reynolds is more than just a tale of revenge or poetic justice. It is a cautionary lesson about the consequences of prejudice and the shifting nature of true power. It forces us to confront deep-seated beliefs about who belongs, who gets to decide, and what real success looks like. At its core, this story is about arrogance and downfall, exclusion and justice, redemption and renewal. But more importantly, it offers life lessons that can be applied to our own journeys, whether in business, relationships, or society as a whole. 1. Exclusivity is not the key to success. Excellence is. For decades, Charles Whitmore believed that his power came from controlling who had access to his world. He meticulously crafted an atmosphere of prestige, subtly deciding who was welcome and who was not. He assumed that exclusivity equaled value, that making his restaurant inaccessible to certain people enhanced its prestige. But the success of La Belle Vie under David and Vanessa's ownership proves something different. True excellence does not come from exclusion, but from the ability to create something that welcomes, uplifts, and inspires. This is a crucial lesson in any industry, in any field. The greatest leaders, innovators, and creators in history did not build their legacies by keeping people out, but by bringing people together. How to apply this lesson? If you are a leader, mentor, or business owner, focus on creating value and fostering inclusivity. A business that thrives is one that embraces change, diversity, and new ideas. Success does not come from keeping others away, but from offering something meaningful that stands the test of time. In personal life, friendships, and relationships, true value comes from connection, not exclusivity. We grow when we invite different perspectives into our lives. 2. Power that relies on prejudice will eventually crumble. Charles Whitmore's entire empire was built on bias and carefully veiled discrimination. He told himself he was upholding tradition, but what he was really upholding was a system that favored some and quietly excluded others. For a long time, this worked, until the world changed. What he failed to understand was that power is not static. The moment his biases were exposed, his empire collapsed faster than he ever expected. Those who once stood by him, his wealthy clientele, his business partners, his investors, abandoned him immediately. This reflects a powerful truth. Power that is rooted in discrimination, injustice, and exclusion is never sustainable. It may last for a while, but eventually, the world moves forward, and those who refuse to evolve get left behind. How to apply this lesson? If you hold a position of influence, whether in business, leadership, or your community, ensure that your power is built on integrity, fairness, and respect. Short-term gains achieved through unfair practices will always backfire in the long run. In everyday life, we must challenge outdated beliefs that promote division. Growth and progress happen when we learn to accept, respect, and uplift others. True strength is not in controlling others, but in leading with fairness and vision. 3. The world does not mourn the fall of those who use power. Unfairly, when Charles lost everything, no one cared. The people who once respected him, who dined at his restaurant, who shook his hand at events, who praised his vision, were nowhere to be found when his downfall came. Why? Because he was never truly respected. He was feared, admired for his power, but never loved or genuinely valued. The moment his power disappeared, so did his influence. His name faded, his legacy was erased, and the world moved on without him. This serves as a reminder that the way we treat people determines how we are remembered. If power is used to uplift, empower, and inspire others, then even in loss, a person's impact remains. But if power is used to suppress, exclude, and divide, then when that power is gone, so is any lasting significance. How to apply this lesson? If you seek respect, admiration, and influence, ensure that it is built on genuine impact, not on fear or intimidation. The most successful leaders are those who empower others, not those who hold people down. Ask yourself, if I lost everything today, what would remain? Would people remember you for what you built? Or would they only remember the damage you caused? 4. The best revenge is success, not in spite, but in growth. David and Vanessa did not destroy Charles out of rage. They didn't scream, fight, or demand public apologies. Instead, they walked away with dignity. And then they built something greater than Charles ever could. Their revenge was not about humiliation. It was about proving that they were always more than what Charles assumed them to be. By taking over La Belle Vie and making it a success, they showed that success is the ultimate response to discrimination. They transformed his restaurant into a symbol of excellence without exclusion, power without prejudice. Their revenge was not about destroying Charles. It was about proving that they never needed his approval to succeed in the first place. How to apply this lesson? When faced with unfair treatment, remember that the best response is to rise higher. Do not allow bitterness to consume you. Channel your energy into growth, success, and transformation. Let your success speak louder than your anger. True power is not about proving someone else wrong. It's about proving yourself right. 5. Legacy is not about what you build. It's about what you leave behind. Charles spent his life building an empire. But what did he actually leave behind? Nothing. The business he built was rebranded. His name was erased. His former clients, investors, and colleagues moved on without a second thought. His legacy did not survive him because it was built on exclusion, fear, and arrogance. David and Vanessa, however, created something lasting. La Belle Vie became more than just a restaurant. It became a testament to resilience, vision, and inclusivity. Their names would be remembered, not just for what they built, but for how they changed the industry. A legacy is not just about success, it's about what you leave behind for others. How to apply this lesson? Consider, what will you be remembered for? Will your name carry weight for the impact you made, or will it be forgotten when your power fades? True legacy is built through positivity, inclusion, and transformation. Instead of focusing on building walls, focus on building bridges. Final reflection, the choice is ours. The story of Charles Whitmore's downfall is not just fiction. It is a reflection of real-life consequences. It is a warning for those who believe that power is eternal, that prejudice will never be challenged, that control is permanent. But it is also a story of hope. David and Vanessa's journey shows that justice is possible, that excellence prevails, that change, when done right, creates something greater than anyone ever imagined. Each of us has the choice. Will we live like Charles Whitmore, holding on to outdated beliefs until we are left with nothing? Or will we be like David and Vanessa Reynolds, choosing resilience, vision, and transformation? The answer will shape not just our own lives, but the legacy we leave behind. How will you choose? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I pour my heart and soul into crafting these meaningful narratives, and your support makes all the difference. Hit that subscribe button and be part of this journey. Thank you.